This is a photograph of a four-story castle. The roof is made of orange tiles, the walls are white, and grass is shown in front of the castle. There are two tall antennae coming out of the right side of the castle. A watchtower is located in the front, and many small windows are located throughout the castle at the top of the walls. There is a city in the background, and skies with clouds are shown above. Figure 3, 1 St. George of the Mine. The castle of St. George of the Mine overlooks the coast of Ghana. Built in the 15th century, it guarded Portugal's trading post at Elmina. From here, the Portuguese traded for enslaved people brought from the interior of the African continent. Credit, modification of work, St. Jago Fort in Elmina, Ghana, by Edward Campbell / Wikimedia Commons, CC by 3.0. Chapter Outline 3.1 The Roots of African Trade 3.2 The Songhai Empire 3.3 The Swahili Coast 3.4 The Trans-Saharan Slave Trade. The Portuguese built the castle of St. George of the Mine, later called Elmina, in the 15th century, which many historians characterize as the beginning of the early modern period. Figure 3. 1. Located on the coast of present-day Ghana, the fortress gave the Portuguese a foothold in the West African gold trade, which was by then largely in the hands of the Kingdom of Songhai, Songhai. The economic health and longevity of the Songhai Empire depended on the secure and smooth operation of the trans-Saharan trade in goods across North Africa. Gold was then unquestionably the most prized of all West African commodities, and in time, the trade in human cargo became equally important. With an eye toward their profit margins, the Portuguese traders at Elmina combined the flows of trade in these two highly valued commodities, becoming intermediaries who provided enslaved people from Benin to the Akan mines in modern-day Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. By the 16th century, Elmina had become one of the earliest direct links between European slavers and the slave markets of the African interior. 600s, East African settlements begin trading in the Indian Ocean. 700s, Islam begins spreading to West Africa. 800 to 1400, camel caravans peak. A map of caravan routes in northern Africa is shown. 1000s, Za adopts Islam. 1200s. Grand Mosque built at Djen. A photograph of the mosque is shown. 1235, Sundiata Keita founds Mali. 1337, Mansa Musa dies. 1444, Portugal begins slave raids in West Africa. 1482, Portugal builds St. George of the Mine, Elmina Castle in Ghana. A photograph of the castle is shown. 1500s, Kanem warriors raid Sudan to sell prisoners into slavery. A picture of a man on a horse surrounded by warriors with shields and long thin sticks is shown. Figure 3.2 Timeline, Early Modern Africa and the Wider World. Credit 801,400. Modification of work, map showing the main trans-Saharan caravan routes circa 1400, by T. L. Miles / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1200s. Modification of work, Great Mosque of Djenné by J. M. / Flickr, CC by 20. Credit 1482. Modification of work, St. Jago Fort in Elmina, Ghana by Edward Campbell / Wikimedia Commons, CC by 3. 0. Credit 1500s. Modification of work, Group of Kanembu Warriors by New York Public Library Digital Gallery / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. A map of the world is shown. The northern portion of Africa down to the equator is highlighted. The Swahili coast on the east coast of Africa is also highlighted. The equator is shown. Figure 3.3 Locator map, Early Modern Africa and the Wider World. Credit. Modification of work, World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the main trade routes across the Sahara in the 16th century. Analyze the ways in which Islam facilitated the development of trans-Saharan trade. Identify the factors that contributed to the decline of the Mali Empire. Beginning in ancient times, trans-Saharan trade routes united many markets and products, linking the commodities, buyers, and sellers of North and West Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Trade networks spanned thousands of miles of sea and land and connected the distant trading centers and cities at their far ends. In the Sahara, such cosmopolitan settlements as Audiobook, Sigilmasa, and Jenne, all part of the Mali Empire, linked desert trade routes. These trading centers made possible not only the widespread distribution of raw materials and finished products necessary for commerce to thrive, but also the diffusion of cultural influences, including religion, to other civilizations. Saharan trade routes. Camel caravans from North Africa began trekking across the Sahara Desert in antiquity, the period before the Common Era, or BCE. The trade reached a peak during the 9th to the 15th centuries of the Common Era, CE, when lines of thousands of camels traveled a web-like network of trade routes that spanned the whole of North and West Africa. They moved a variety of goods, including copper, salt, ivory, enslaved people, textiles, and gold, northward from sub-Saharan West Africa to the Mediterranean coast, eastward to the Horn of Africa and Egypt, and southward into the Sahel, the semi-arid region between the Sahara Desert and the Sudanian savanna to the south. Figure 3. 4. A map of North Africa is shown. There are dotted lines connecting cities across the entire region north to south and east to west. The following cities are labeled: Marrakesh, Sigilmasa, Audiobook, Timbuktu, Jen, Gao, Agadez, Bilma, Zawila, Kufra, Cairo, Suakin, and Zaila. One dotted line crosses the Red Sea from Suakin in Africa to Arabia. The Mali Empire in Western Africa, the Ghana Empire in Northwestern Africa, Kanem-Bornu in Central North Africa, and Egypt in Northeastern Africa are labeled. Figure 3. 4. Trans-Saharan trade routes. The trans-Saharan trade routes of the 9th to 15th centuries, red dotted lines, stretched like a web across the vast expanse of North Africa. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. Long before the trans-Saharan trade route's golden age, commerce in the Sahara was relatively localized and consisted of the exchange of agricultural products like rice, sorghum, and millet for the products of new technologies such as iron goods or rare commodities such as salt. These early inter- and intra-regional exchanges were made possible by pack animals like mules, horses, and donkeys. But trade was limited because these animals were biologically ill-suited for the extremes of the Saharan environment. When the Romans conquered North Africa in the 2nd century BCE, they introduced the camel, which was already a beast of burden in Egypt. Capable of lasting days without water and having feet and eyelashes adapted for travel in sandy environments, camels enabled the people of North Africa to carry on regular long-distance trade across the Sahara for the first time beginning in the 8th century CE. The camel saddle, invented by the Tuareg people of North Africa, enabled camels to be ridden, which furthered their usefulness to trans-Saharan trade. The introduction of the date palm also helped make systematic long-distance trade possible. The fruit of the date palm is high in sugar, a natural preservative, and when dried it provided a high-calorie, easily transportable food supply to fortify traders on long journeys. Trans-Saharan trade was also critically dependent on highly paid nomadic North African Berber, Amazigh, one intermediaries, and the string of oasis towns that connected distant parts of the network in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Figure 3. 5. Oasis towns provided traveling merchants with places to rest, water their animals, and acquire provisions for the next leg of their journey. They served the same function as the caravanserais, inns for travelers that existed throughout the Islamic world, including along the Silk Roads in Asia, in the Middle East, and in Egypt and Morocco. The Amazighen's skills as caravan leaders and go-betweens facilitated the movement of everything from gold ingots to ostrich feathers across thousands of square miles of desert. Yet Amazigh traders were responsible for much more than the movement of goods and commodities. They were also devout believers in Islam who spread Islamic culture, law, custom, and tradition, and helped to fuse a network of local and regional trade routes into a truly continent-spanning enterprise. This photograph shows a cluster of green trees in front of a city with brown buildings and sparse trees. Sand hills are located in the background and a blue sky. In the foreground there is rough, dry, sand-colored land. Figure 3. 5. A Saharan oasis. This photo shows the Saharan oasis city of Taghit, ringed by sand hills in modern-day Algeria. Credit: mountains of sand loom over the oasis village of Taghit in the Sahara by the Central Intelligence Agency. The World Factbook/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. A principal commodity exchanged during this early stage of trade was salt, which acted as a sort of currency. Not only is salt necessary to human and animal life, but it also helps to preserve foods, an important concern of people in an age before refrigeration technology existed. Communities on the edges of the desert acted as intermediaries in this trade, trading salt to forest tribes to the south that had access to gold fields. Only over time were other highly valuable trading goods introduced, such as gold and copper, which were then passed across the desert from tropical West Africa to the far reaches of the North African coast and beyond. Trade across the Sahara gradually intensified between the 5th and 7th centuries CE, and in the 8th and 9th centuries, a series of main links became established. These developments were made possible primarily as the result of two important changes. First, the Ghana Empire of West Africa emerged as the earliest large-scale political entity in the region. And second, the Islamic conquest of North Africa led to the rise of Muslim states and a general cultural unification of the region. Combined, these developments brought people with shared interests and similar characteristics together, in conditions that enabled them to consolidate and expand their economic interests, particularly as demand increased for gold from the Sudan. As trade grew, Arab merchants in Morocco and in Islamic states in North Africa began to buy sub-Saharan gold. By the 11th century, the gold trade was so successful that it was influencing commerce and society in the Mediterranean. Figure 3. 6. For the first time, West African gold was used to mint European coins. This growth in the market for gold spurred the expansion of new links in the trans-Saharan trade route and resulted in the opening of a major trade artery between the towns of Sijilmassa, north of the Sahara, and Audiobook to the south. A map of northwest Africa is shown. In the western portion of the map, there are gold-colored sections by the regions of Bambuk, Bur, and Lobai, and south of Lobai indicated. These are identified in the key as gold fields. Starting at the north of the continent and heading south, the cities of Tunis, Kairouan, Tahert, Tlemcen, Fes, Marrakesh, Null, Tamdil, Sijilmassa, Ouagla, Gadames, Taimentit, Gaut, Taikda, Gao, Tadmeka, Timbuktu, Ariayu, Taghaza, Ariayu, and Ijil, Wadane, Audiobook, Walata, Kumbai, and Sale are labeled and connected with dotted lines. The city of Jen is labeled as well as the region of Tuat. Audiobook and Sijilmassa are circled. Figure 3-6 West African trade routes. The network of medieval trade routes in West Africa, red dotted lines, as mapped in the 1960s by French historian Raymond Money. Although they were not connected directly, Sijilmassa in present-day Morocco and Audiobook in Mauritania were indirectly linked by routes that united other trading cities in the surrounding region. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. One of the greatest early Sudanic empires, the powerful states that emerged in the region of West Africa south of the Sahara Desert, was Mali. Mali brought together the key components that had contributed to the earlier expansion of trans-Saharan trade. On the one hand, its rulers were Muslim, and the fact that they shared the same religion with many trans-Saharan traders strengthened the ties between these groups. On the other hand, these rulers exerted direct control over the goldfields at Bure. The vitally important trade centers of Timbuktu and Gao were part of the empire, as were the trading centers of Ouaghost, Walata, and Tadmeka. Although both gold and salt remained the principal commodities of exchange, other commodities such as textiles, enslaved people, ivory, precious stones, and shea butter, a vegetable fat from the shea tree nut, were also regular exports. During the 9th to 15th centuries, caravans routinely plied the sands of the Sahara, moving goods from distant West Africa to Egypt and centers of trade in North Africa, and from there onward, either across the Mediterranean to southern Europe or overland by way of the Sinai Peninsula to the region of the Levant in the Near East, modern Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel. From there, West African commodities could arrive at one of the land-based western terminals of the Silk Roads in such trade centers as the coastal city of Tyre in Lebanon, and farther inland, at Aleppo in Syria. Africa at this time was a key player in the vast commercial enterprise that laid the foundation for the first global economies. The spread of Islam, the Arab conquests of North Africa, and the gradual advance of Islam into West Africa from the 8th century did much to unify what had been largely regional trade into a truly cross-desert system of commerce. The spread and adoption of Islam by nomads, such as the Tuareg and Sanhaja of the Niger region, helped expand the networks of exchange. Shared values and rules established by Islamic tradition and law engendered a sense of mutual trust and respect among devout Muslim traders and caravanners. African traders and merchants recognized other benefits of conversion beyond the spiritual, which included guarantees afforded by contract law that was based on Islamic law and made possible by widespread Arabic literacy. They also enjoyed the extension of credit and promissory notes between multiple parties, who were all investors in a caravan, and an increasingly extensive information network in which oasis towns acted as centers of communication and exchange. Africans may also have been led to convert to Islam by other factors. A significant motivation was likely the harsh terms the conquering Muslims imposed on non-Muslims, which included exorbitant taxation as well as demands for hundreds, according to some sources, thousands of enslaved people. These people, the majority of whom were probably Amazigh, were then shipped to markets in Damascus or Baghdad to be sold or transported onward to other market towns in the east. Since Islamic law forbade the enslavement of fellow Muslims, countless Amazigh people decided to convert to avoid being taken captive. Once Islam reached the savannah south of the Sahara, ruling African elites adopted it, and in some cases they blended it with their traditional beliefs, a process called syncretism. Muslims who could read and write Arabic script were sought after as administrators by rulers whose languages did not have their own alphabets. The tendency of non-Muslim kingdoms to employ Muslim merchant scholars as advisors and scribes, as, for example, in the Kingdom of Ghana, in turn, helped raise the profile of Islam among Africans and further encouraged conversion. As commerce expanded, Islam gradually spread along the trans-Saharan trade routes and created a network of believers who trusted each other, thanks to a common language, Arabic, and shared values, traditions, and customs such as regular daily prayer. These shared social bonds and trust allowed trade to increase among peoples at some considerable distance who were otherwise unknown to one another. Another social interaction crucial to the widespread diffusion of Islam was intermarriage between Muslim traders and local women, who raised their children as Muslims. By the 13th century, Islam had spread into the region of Lake Chad and the Kingdom of Canaan by way of trans-Saharan trade, figure 3-7. A map of the continent of Africa is shown. There is a pink portion in Western Africa labeled Mali Empire, and in the middle of Northern Africa there is a green area labeled Kanem-Bornu Empire. Red dotted lines that indicate trade routes crisscross the northern part of the continent from black dots, with two crossing the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden into Arabia. Blue dots that indicate the spread of Islam cover all of North Africa, Arabia, the portion of Asia shown, southern Europe, and the eastern coast of Africa. Figure 3-7 The spread of Islam. By the 14th century, Islam had spread throughout North and West Africa, including Kanem-Bornu Green area, and had become the state religion in the Kingdom of Mali Pink area, and in time in Songhai, Mali's successor. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. The Mali Empire. Larger political entities emerged in Sudanic West Africa, beginning with the Mali Empire in the early 13th century. Around 1235, Sundiata Keita, the founder of Mali, set about consolidating his control over the heartland of the Mande people, a region centered on the well-watered grasslands of the upper reaches of the Senegal and Niger rivers. Sundiata convinced the other Malinke, also known as Mandinka, kings to surrender their title, Mansa, which means ruler in the Malinke language, to him. He thus became the sole Mansa, the religious and secular leader of all the Malinke people. Sundiata then moved to expand the Mali kingdom by taking control of all the Soninke peoples, figure 3. 8. This territory took in much of the former Kingdom of Ghana and its nominally independent peripheral vassal states, including Mema and Wagadu. These newly conquered territories were often administered indirectly, leaving in place friendly puppet regimes to do the bidding of the Malian monarch, a political strategy that bred resentment among certain of the Malian vassal states, including Takrur and Songhai. In a few short years, the empire extended from the forested margins of the southwest through the grassland savanna country of the Malinke and the southern Soninke to the Sahel of former Ghana. The kings of Mali were less interested in conquering the various small kingdoms and chiefdoms of the grasslands than in taking the trading towns of the Sahel that linked the regional economy to the vast trans-Saharan trade. These towns were key prizes to the Malian monarchs and included Djenné, Timbuktu, and Gao. Throughout history, economic considerations have often driven political decisions, like conquering neighboring people, made by rulers on all continents. A map of Northwest Africa is shown. The Tropic of Cancer and the Atlantic Ocean are shown to the west, and the Gulf of Guinea and the equator are shown to the south. A pink area is highlighted in the middle of the western portion and labeled Mali Empire. Figure 3-8 The Mali Empire. The Mali Empire reached its maximum geographic extent in the 14th century, stretching from the mouth of the Senegal River in the west to the borders of present-day Algeria and Niger in the east, encompassing some 478,000 square miles and about 400 cities. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. When Sundiata's successors converted to Islam, Mali became the largest Islamic kingdom in West Africa. Although its heartland was the Niger floodplain, Mali's capital Niamey was located at the Bure goldfields, enabling its rulers to exert direct control over the most valuable of all the raw materials transported along the trans-Saharan trade routes. Mali's fabulous wealth made it famous, and its rulers used that wealth to attract scholars and jurists from all over the Islamic world. For example, Mali's most famous ruler, the 14th century Mansa Musa, transformed the trading center of Timbuktu by establishing mosques and schools there that became repositories of Islamic scholarship and learning. Link to learning. An introduction to the spread of Islam to West Africa is provided by the Lowcountry Digital History Initiative. Trans-Saharan commerce also promoted the development of public works in Mali, including the building of social and religious structures. Travelers to West Africa were impressed by the palaces, walled cities, and mosques they saw there and often remarked on them. In the 16th century, Leo Africanus, a formerly enslaved Amazigh diplomat and writer, born Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazin, visited Songhai and praised the fine architecture of the city of Timbuktu, particularly the walled palace of the king and the temple of stone and mortar that dominated the center of the city. While these buildings awed many visitors, none were quite as striking as Timbuktu's mosques, with its sun-baked brick walls and spiky pyramidal shape. For example, the Sankore Mosque presented onlookers with a unique example of West African architecture at this time. Figure 3. 9. The postcard shows a brown, sandy mosque with tall walls and a 7-story building in the middle showing above the walls. No openings are visible in the walls. In the background, a city with low buildings is shown. A person is visible in the foreground standing next to one of 2 bushes. Figure 3. 9. The Sankore Mosque. The 14th century Sankore Mosque, shown in this postcard from about 1905, was one of the leading centers of Islamic learning and scholarship in Timbuktu. It is also an example of Sudanese West Africa's unique architectural style and has long dominated the city's skyline. Credit: 40 or 368 Timbuktu Sankore Mosque by Dogon/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Click this link to read an excerpt in which the 16th century traveler Leo Africanus describes the town of Timbuktu and his experiences while there. The fortunes of the Mali Empire were transformed in the 15th century, when a host of internal and external challenges combined to fatally undermine the Sudanic kingdom, including rebellions, dynastic disputes, the rise of powerful new neighbors, and the arrival of the Portuguese. These factors, which are explained next, had the effect of weakening Mali economically and politically, setting it up for instability and collapse. The successors of Mansa Musa, who died circa 1337, tended to be weaker and less influential than their famous predecessor. During the brief reign of his son, Mansa Magan, Timbuktu was raided and burned by the Masi, a people who lived to the south of the Niger Bend. Although the Malians returned to the city and ruled it for another 100 years, the Masi raid demonstrated to others that the empire had been diminished. Later, Tuareg nomads raided and caused havoc. They occupied and governed Timbuktu for the next 40 years. The attacks by the Masi and Tuareg squeezed the enfeebled Malian Empire from the north and east. These raids were followed by rebellions in towns, signaling a more dramatic shift in the region's geopolitics, whereby many of the empire's most important cities sought to break free of Malian rule. Between 1374 and 1387, uprisings occurred in the salt-producing center of Takeda and in the major trading center of Gao. While Mansa Musa II managed to subdue the Tuareg rebellion at Takeda, he was unable to control the Songhai of Gao, who asserted their independence from Mali. By the 1430s, Mali had lost control not only of Timbuktu, but also of vassal kingdoms such as Mema to the north, and critical trading towns such as Djenné had also regained their independence. The past meets the present, preserving Mali's past. Who owns a nation's history? Who decides what constitutes an appropriate expression of religious faith? In Mali, such issues have occasioned much debate in the recent past. Many of the Malian Empire's most important historical and religious sites are in danger as a result of political conflict. In 2012, members of the Tuareg separatist group, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, which seeks independence for northern Mali, and members of Ansar Dine, a group linked to al-Qaeda, attacked mosques in the city of Timbuktu. Members of these groups believe the mosques violate Islamic prescriptions for religious buildings and are idolatrous. In Djenné, to the south, the preservation of Mali's Islamic heritage has encountered other problems. Each year since the Great Mosque was built, the residents of Djenné have applied a new layer of mud to replace the coat washed away during the rainy season. As time has passed, the layers have accumulated, damaging the structure. For several years, The practice had to cease while reconstruction of the building took place, angering the worshippers, who believe they acquire religious merit by repairing the mosque. Some residents also have cause to dislike the mosque's designation as part of a UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, World Heritage Site in 1988. The designation protects not only the mosque, but also the surrounding mud brick houses from alteration. This has prevented those who live there from modernizing their homes. Do you agree with UNESCO's position that World Heritage Sites belong to all the peoples of the world, irrespective of the territory on which they are located? Who has the right to decide how historical and religious sites should be treated? Why? As a result of weak rulers, rebellions, and attacks by the Mossi and Tuareg, the trading towns and routes on which the Mansas depended for their wealth and power were gradually being stripped away from the Malian Empire, when the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century complicated matters. The first Portuguese slave raids in West Africa took place on the Senegambian coast, the Atlantic coastline of Senegal and the Gambia in West Africa, in 1444. Initially, the raids caught Malian vassal territories off guard, but they soon recovered and effectively resisted further European encroachment. In 1462, the Portuguese were forced to negotiate a peace treaty, which limited them to trading along the Senegambian coast. This new, direct trade between a European power and Mande merchants along the coast was the first of several steps that ultimately rerouted much commerce away from the trans-Saharan trade routes of the West African interior. As the European threat gradually faded, pressure mounted on the Mali Empire's eastern and northern frontiers. There, the emergent Songhai Empire under the leadership of Sunni Ali was expanding, and in a series of conquests, it managed to annex the former Malian territory of Mema, 1465, capture Timbuktu, 1468, and seize Djenné, 1473. By the end of the century, nearly all the lands the Mali Empire once ruled had been lost. What remained was little more than the Mande-speaking heartland and surrounding grassland. Mali continued in this diminished state until the late 17th century, by which time most non-Malinke people had asserted their independence and reverted to rule by individual Mansas. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the characteristics that defined Imperial Songhai. Discuss the ways in which internal conflict led to the decline of the Songhai Empire. The Sudanic Kingdom of Songhai was the largest 15th-century African state in West Africa. At its height, it stretched from Senegal, Gambia on the Atlantic coast in the west, all the way to Kano in the Hausaland region of present-day Nigeria in the southeast, and to the salt mining trade center of Taghaza in the north. Founded by Sunni Ali in the late 15th century, Songhai reached its imperial height under the founder of the Askia dynasty, Mohammed Tur, a general and provisional governor who overthrew Sunni Ali's legitimate successor. The rise of Imperial Songhai. The earliest dynasty of kings of the Songhai state was the Za, which tradition and later historical records suggest ruled the kingdom during the 11th and 12th centuries. Tradition also holds that the first 14 rulers of the Songhai state, which was initially centered on Kukia, approximately 80 miles southeast of Gao, were Jahiliya, ignorant of God. Jahiliya is a word used by Muslims to describe the ignorance of people before gaining knowledge of Islam. Sometime in the 1000s, the dynasty converted to Islam, possibly under Za Qusay. It was also at some point during this period that the political focus of the kingdom shifted from Kukia to Gao. As kola nuts, dates, ivory, salt, leather, enslaved people, and gold passed through the capital, traders and merchants prospered. While a boon locally, the prosperity of Gao drew the attention of the new and expansionistic West African kingdom of Mali, which annexed Gao around 1325. This was the heyday of Imperial Mali, and for the next century, Its rulers profited from Gao's trade and collected taxes from its kings. Link to learning. To learn more about the Songhai Empire, watch the Songhai Empire, Africa's Age of Gold, and consider why it is called a cosmopolitan empire. What was unique about Timbuktu? The annexation of Gao greatly expanded the Malian Empire, but it did not last. Periodic rebellions by the peoples of Timbuktu, Taita, and Gao, coupled with invasions from the north, civil war, and a struggling economy, caused Gao's Malian rulers to withdraw from the region in the 1430s. The leader of the Songhai rebels at Gao, Sunni Ali, became the first king of the new Songhai Empire. From his capital at Gao, Sunni Ali engaged in a war of conquest against his Muslim neighbors. Marshalling his massive cavalry and fleet of war canoes, the king extended his empire into the desert in the north and as far as Jenne in the southwest. In the late 15th century, his army pushed southward beyond the Niger and raided deep into the Volta River basin, encroaching on the territory of the Mossi, multiple linguistic groups whose cultures differed but who were loosely connected politically. In 1468, Sunni Ali sacked Timbuktu. He drove its Amazigh governor from the city, killed many of its scholars, and forced others into exile. Sunni Ali's conquest of Timbuktu earned him a reputation as a butcher and a tyrant. He perpetuated terrible wickedness in the city, putting it to flame, sacking it, and killing large numbers of people. One chronicler from Timbuktu recorded, Sunni Ali's assault on the scholarly community at Timbuktu prompted the survivors' exodus to Walata, leading to a significant decline in Islamic scholarship at Timbuktu. Many of the merchants who had thrived under the city's Tuareg overlords also fled. As a result, the city slipped into a period of economic decline and did not recover until after Sunni Ali's death. It was not enough for Sunni Ali to capture Timbuktu. Securing the vital corridor of trade along the growing Songhai Empire's western frontier also required capturing the southern trading center of Jenne, a long-standing point of exchange for caravans carrying salt, gold, and enslaved Africans bound for the Atlantic or trans-Saharan slave trades. Sunni Ali attempted to capture Jenne for several years, but the fact that the city was surrounded by water during the annual flooding of the Bani River made the task impossible. Only after a 7-month siege was he finally able to subdue the city, which surrendered in 1473. In contrast to his harsh actions at Timbuktu, Sunni Ali accommodated the community of Muslim scholars at Jenne, where they remained great preservers of Islamic learning and continued to produce work on Islamic philosophy and the sciences through the 17th century. The mosque and university had thousands of teachers and students who mastered a wide range of subjects, including Islamic law, astronomy, math, and philosophy. Figure 310. A photograph shows a large, brown structure with many points along the top. 3 portions are shown jutting out. Stairs in the front lead to a wooden door. A sign stands at the bottom of the stairs. There is a row of openings at the top of the walls and many projections coming out of the walls in organized rows. A person is walking in front of the stairs on a sandy stretch of land. Figure 3:10. The Great Mosque at Jenne. The earliest version of the Great Mosque at Jenne was built in the 13th and 14th centuries. Founded as a center of religious learning and scholarship, the Great Mosque continues to serve these functions today, although it is now at least the 3rd version of the structure. Credit, Great Mosque of Jenne by JM/Flickr, CC by 20. The reign of Askia the Great. On the death of Sunni Ali in 1492, his son Sani Baru came to the throne but reigned less than a year. Muhammad Tur, one of Sunni Ali's generals and provincial governors, challenged Sani Baru, and when the two met in battle in April 1493, Sani Baru was defeated. Muhammad Tur then usurped the throne and took power as Askia Muhammad, later known as Askia the Great. His reign marked the beginning of the Askia dynasty. Askia the Great strengthened the Songhai Empire and made it the largest in West Africa's history, by adding tributary lands to the east and to the west. At its height, the Songhai Empire stretched from Kano and Hausaland in the southeast, present-day Nigeria, to Taghaza with its valuable salt mines in the north, and modern-day Senegal on the Atlantic coast, figure 311. One of Askia's primary objectives was to control access to the major trade routes across the Sahara. His success in doing so was rapid. By 1512, it is chronicled that even the Mansa of Mali was paying tribute to Askia. Two maps are shown. The map to the right shows the continent of Africa. Many cities are labeled, and a red portion is highlighted in West Africa. The map on the left shows a zoomed-in view of West Africa. A circular area in Western Africa is labeled Ghana Empire. A pink area is labeled Mali Empire and stretches from the Atlantic to the middle of the map. The region overlaps with most of the region labeled Ghana Empire. A blue area is labeled Songhai Empire. It overlaps with the southeastern half of the Ghana Empire and most of the Mali Empire. The Songhai Empire stretches beyond these empires farther north and east, figure 3. 11 West Africa's early empires. This map shows the different polities of medieval West Africa. The Songhai Empire was the largest and wealthiest of the three great Sudanic empires. The other two were Ghana and Mali. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. Askia the Great also transformed the nature of Songhai rulership. Under Sunni Ali, Songhai administration at the provincial level had been left in the hands of traditional rulers. Askia abandoned this model in favor of designating royal family members or trusted servants. As appointees of the king, these provincial governors were entirely dependent on the ruler and had to remain in his favor. The governors were invested with a great deal of authority, however. They could, for example, raise their own armies to collect local taxes. Abandoning the use of traditional rulers had the effect of strengthening the centralizing tendency of the state under Sunni Ali. Whereas before such provincial officials might take advantage of dynastic struggles to assert their authority and form a breakaway region or state, the placement of royally appointed officials closely aligned with the king dramatically curtailed this risk. That the state remained intact despite frequent dynastic struggles during Askia's later reign speaks to the success of this policy. Islam was crucial to Askia the Great's consolidation of control. Not ethnically Songhai, and thus unable to rely on traditional institutions and rituals to legitimate his rule, Askia instead based his authority on Islam and quickly set out to establish Songhai as a Muslim kingdom. In 1498, he declared a holy war against the non-Muslim Masi to justify his incursions into their territory. He also recognized the importance of Islam to trans-Saharan trade and used his post-accession pilgrimage to Mecca to advertise his concern for the faith. During his stopover in Cairo, Askia convinced Egypt's caliph, its spiritual and secular leader, to recognize him as caliph of the whole of Sudan. While in Mecca, he spent lavishly, contributing some 100,000 gold pieces to charity and related almsgiving programs. He did not force his subjects to convert, however, and most retained their traditional religious beliefs. Dueling voices. The great ruler of Songhai, Askia Mohammed. The following sources were written by observers of the Songhai Empire. The first, called the Epic of Askia Mohammed, is a written rendition of a tale told by a griot, a West African oral historian, poet, musician, storyteller, and praise singer, and describes how Askia the Great established his empire. In the excerpt, Askia Muhammad is told how he can repent for having killed his uncle. The second excerpt is from Leo Africanus's description of Africa, which he wrote in the 16th century and describes the city of Gao and the tactics of Askia Mohammed. Go home and start a holy war, so that you can make them submit until you reach the Red Sea. Askia Muhammad went home to Gao. It is at this time he gathered together all the horses. He took all the horses. He began by the west. Early in the morning, they pillage and they go on to the next village. The cavalryman who goes there. He traces on the ground for the people the plan for the mosque. The people build the mosque. It is at that time. Mamerkase Askia Muhammad comes to dismount from his horse. He makes the people. They teach them verses from the Quran relating to prayer. They teach them prayers from the Quran. Any villages that refuse, he destroys the village, burns it, and moves on. Until that day, he arrived at the Red Sea, Nahumalyo, the epic of Askia Mohammed, the town and kingdom Songhay of Gao. Here are very rich merchants, and to here journey continually large numbers of blacks who purchase here cloth from Barbary, North Africa, and Europe. Here also is a certain place where slaves are sold, especially upon those days when merchants assemble. A young slave of 15 years of age is sold for 6 ducats, gold coins, and children are also sold. The king of this region has a certain private palace in which he keeps a large number of concubines and slaves, who are watched by eunuchs. To guard his person, he maintains a sufficient troop of horsemen and foot soldiers. Between the first gate of the palace and the inner part, there is a walled enclosure wherein the king personally decides all of his subjects' controversies. Although the king is most diligent in this regard and conducts all business in these matters, he has in his company counselors and such other officers as his secretaries, treasurers, stewards, and auditors. It is a wonder to see the quality of merchandise that is daily brought here and how costly and sumptuous everything is. The rest of this kingdom contains nothing but villages and hamlets inhabited by herdsmen and shepherds, who in winter cover their bodies with the skins of animals, but in summer they go naked, save for their private parts. They are continually burdened by heavy taxes, to the point that they scarcely have anything left on which to live. Of the province of Kano. The great province of Kano stands eastward of the river Niger almost 500 miles. Their king had mighty troops of horsemen at his command, but he has since been constrained to pay tribute unto the kings of Zegzeg and Kaisna. Afterward Askia, the king of Timbuktu Songhay, feigning friendship treacherously slew them both. And then he waged war against the king of Kano, whom after a long siege he took, and compelled him to marry one of his daughters, restoring him again to his kingdom, conditionally that he should pay unto him the third part of all his tribute taxes. And the said king of Timbuktu has some of his courtiers perpetually residing at Kano for the receipt receiving thereof. Leo Africanus, Description of Africa, 1550. How do the two accounts differ in their description of Askia the Great? According to these accounts, how did Askia establish and maintain power in his empire? Would you consider Askia the Great to have been a strong ruler? Would you consider him to have been a benevolent ruler? Why or why not? Askia the Great extended his territory deeper into the desert through military conquest. The advance of Songhai's army forced the Tuareg nomads to flee, which allowed the Songhai to capture the salt-producing center of Taghaza in the north. Askia did more to regulate trans-Saharan trade than any of his predecessors. He not only introduced the use of standardized weights and measures, but also employed trade inspectors at each of the empire's major trade centers. The Hausaland kingdoms recognized the revival of trade under the Songhai and its benefits, and so came into the orbit of the Songhai Empire's broader trading network. The primary sources of the Songhai Empire's wealth continued to be agricultural production centered on the Niger floodplain and taxes on trade goods, especially gold and salt, both of which had also been key to the economy of the Mali Empire. Salt remained Songhai's currency for external trade, while cowrie shells were used for internal trade, figure 312. Cowrie shells were imported from the Indian Ocean. They were thus relatively scarce and could not be counterfeited. Gold remained the primary good transported along the trans-Saharan trade routes, but enslaved captives and kola nuts were also exported. The empire imported a variety of goods, including Saharan salt, luxury goods, horses, and cloth. This photograph shows a white oval-shaped shell. There is an opening slit in the middle that is jagged at the top and bottom. The outside of the shell is smooth. Figure 312 cowrie shell. Cowrie shells were used as currency and to adorn religious objects in several African societies. Cowrie shells served a similar function in South Asia and East Asia. This shell was found with an Egyptian mummy from the 4th century BCE. Credit, modification of work cowrie shell by Metropolitan Museum of Art / Wikimedia Commons, CC010. Timbuktu, which had been destroyed by Sunni Ali, revived during the rule of Askia the Great. Leo Africanus observed that the city was a prosperous one filled with artisans and wealthy merchants as well as many enslaved people. According to his 16th century account, in Timbuktu there were great numbers of religious teachers, judges, scholars, and other learned persons, who are bountifully maintained at the king's expense. Here too are brought various manuscripts or written books from Barbary, which are sold for more money than any other merchandise. By the mid-16th century, public libraries had been established, and scribes and calligraphers had been hired to copy books, figure 3:13. As Islamic scholarship once again flourished at Timbuktu, so too did higher learning. Students engaged in multiple tutorials in various fields of study with Islamic scholars, and when they achieved mastery of these subjects, went on to become teachers themselves. A photograph of 2 pages from a manuscript is shown. Both pages are brown, look worn, with water marks along the top and bottom. Both have pointed and round edges with a few tears showing. The left page has 2 circles with a web design in the middle, with writing inside the design. There is writing surrounding the circles. The page on the right has 1 large circular drawing with a web design and writing inside, with writing below the circle. Figure 313, a revival of learning in Timbuktu. Handwritten and illuminated, containing painted decoration, manuscripts preserved at Timbuktu are among the great cultural treasures of Islam. Many thousands of these graced the shelves of the mosques and private libraries throughout the revitalized Timbuktu of the 16th century. Credit, Timbuktu manuscripts by your Astro / Elias Altmami / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Learn about and see pictures of the tomb of Askia the Great in Gao, Mali. You can follow links on the same page to learn about other items of historical interest in Mali. The decline of Songhai. Under Askia the Great, the Songhai Empire flourished. Religious scholars and poets flocked to cities like Timbuktu and Jenne. Islam became more widely practiced. The state embarked on an ambitious infrastructure development scheme, including the construction of canals to enhance agricultural production. Trans-Saharan trade thrived. However, as Askia grew older, his personal power declined, and he relied heavily on his palace officials to manage the affairs of the empire. This alienated his family members, who grew resentful of the power of Askia's head chamberlain, Ali Fulan. In 1528, Askia's sons revolted, deposed him, and declared one of the brothers, Musa, king. Askia Musa's accession was not smooth, however, and civil war erupted. As Askia Musa waged battle against his kin to retain his position, dozens of his relatives were killed. Musa himself fell victim to this strife and was killed by his brothers in 1531, deepening the crisis and further destabilizing the state. As successive rulers, attempts at governing the empire failed, political chaos consumed the ruling class and military as they vied for control. Without effective administration from the center, Songhai weakened, and external groups began eyeing an opportunity to intervene and seize control of the lucrative trans-Saharan trade in salt and gold. This was particularly the case for the Saadi dynasty of Morocco. In 1578, the Saadi had repulsed an invasion by the Portuguese, but only at an enormous cost, draining the imperial coffers. To stave off bankruptcy, Sultan Ahmed I al-Mansur Saadi cast about for new resources. All this unfolded just as a sense of stability, and calm had returned to Songhai under the reign of Askia Ishak II, which began in 1588. However, this revival of Songhai's fortunes proved short-lived. The Saadi invaded in 1591. Although it was greatly outnumbered by the forces of Songhai, the Saadi army had an insurmountable advantage. A stockpile of guns, ammunition, and cannon supplied by Queen Elizabeth I of England, who hoped to make Morocco an ally against Spain. The Saadi army also contained many Spanish Muslims. In 1502, the Spanish monarchs had ordered all Muslims in Spain to convert to Christianity, and many Muslims had fled the country. Outmatched, the larger Songhai army was defeated at the Battle of Tondabai, and Askia Ishak II was killed. Following their victory on the battlefield, the commander of the Saadi army, an enslaved Spanish eunuch named Judar Pasha, moved on the key cities and trading centers of the empire. The Saadi sacked and pillaged Janneh, Gao, and Timbuktu, burning them to the ground. To seal their victory, the invaders filled in water wells and destroyed fields of crops. They spared few, not even women and children. The Songhai Empire's power was rendered ineffective after the looting and destruction of these cities. A decade later, the empire was shattered, its provinces divided into several smaller kingdoms and territories. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain how geography and climate contributed to the growth of trade along the Swahili coast. Identify the major commodities traded along the Swahili coast. Analyze the role of the slave trade in city-states along the Swahili coast. Describe the significance of Kilwa and Zanzibar to Indian Ocean trade. Not all of Africa's trade traversed the Sahara. The east coast of Africa was home to wealthy city-states that engaged in oceanic trade with the Arabian Peninsula, India, and places farther east. Just as the cities of Songhai linked sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa and the Mediterranean by means of trade, the African ports on the Indian Ocean connected Africa to South and East Asia. These city-states were important hubs in the trade between East and West, and made some of the world's most desirable products available to people on 3 continents. The rise of the Swahili city-states. Starting in the 7th century, settlements on the coast of East Africa began to participate in Indian Ocean trade. Geographically, the area was well suited for oceanic trade. In the summer, the prevailing winds blew sailing ships northeast toward the coast of India, and winter winds blew them in the opposite direction. A seasonal trade thus developed, and trading ports grew. The standard ship of the region, called a dhow, was a vessel made of coconut wood planks sewn together with coconut fiber. It bore a triangular-shaped lateen sail, which was perfectly designed to enable ships to sail both with and into the wind, figure 3.14. However, dhows were unable to ride the rougher waves near the southern tip of the African continent, and this limitation, together with the fact that the monsoon winds grew weaker the farther south they went, kept trading ports from extending the full length of the African coast. The postage stamp is white and green with a black border. The middle of the stamp shows a sailing ship with 2 masts in water with trees in the background. An ornate knife is drawn on both sides of the stamp, with vines above each. Across the top is the word Aden, and 12A is in each of the bottom corners. Figure 3.14 lateen sails. An early 20th century postage stamp from Aden, a city of the Arabian Peninsula, shows a dhow with lateen sails. Ships of this type carried the trade of the Swahili coast. Credit: Aden Hafana stamp of 1937 by unknown Stan Sheb / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In the 8th century, Arab Muslim merchants began to settle permanently in the region, and often intermarried with the African Bantu peoples who lived in the area. Marrying Bantu women enabled Arab merchants to sink roots in African coastal communities, and their wives, families helped them both establish commercial contacts and transact trade while they were away. In the 12th century, large numbers of Persians settled on the East African coast as well. Their city-states, inhabited primarily by merchants and artisans, grew in size until a number of large port cities extended southward along the coast from what is now Somalia. Mogadishu, Barawa, Mombasa, Malindi, Pemba, Zanzibar, Kilwa, Sofala, and others. Figure 315. Some of the cities were built on islands, which made it easier for them to engage in maritime trade. The people of the coast came to speak Swahili, which combined the grammar of African Bantu languages with a Bantu and Arabic vocabulary. This common language enabled people from a wide variety of ethnic groups to trade with one another. A map of the continent of Africa is shown. A portion of eastern Africa, labeled the Horn of Africa, borders the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean. It extends into Africa to include Lake Tana and part of Lake Victoria. A thin green area is highlighted on the east coast of Africa from south of the city of Sofala up to a portion north of the city of Mogadishu. The northernmost portion of Madagascar is also highlighted green. Dashed lines from the south of Africa starting in the city of Sofala go up along the coast heading north, stopping in the cities of Pemba, Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Malindi, Barawa, and Mogadishu. From there, the dashed lines go up around the Horn of Africa, splitting into two, one going into the Gulf of Aden, up through the Red Sea to the Suez Canal, and the other going around the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula, and then north through the Arabian Gulf and back out to the Indian Ocean. Figure 315. City-states of the Indian Ocean trade. The coastal region immediately south of the Horn of Africa was home to a number of city-states that prospered in the Indian Ocean trade before the arrival of the Portuguese in the late 15th century. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. Link to learning. This webpage contains interesting facts about the Swahili language, along with the Swahili alphabet, Swahili numbers and phrases, recordings of people reading texts in Swahili, and videos of Swahili being used in everyday life. The Bantu people who lived along the coast of East Africa converted to Islam over the course of a few centuries. Sharing a religion made it easier for them to interact with the Arab and Persian merchants and sailors who inhabited cities on the coast of East Africa, as well as with Muslim merchants in North Africa, on the Arabian Peninsula, and in India. Mosques and religious schools were built. The first mosques were built in the 9th century. The version of Islam practiced by the people of the Swahili coast, however, made concessions to the pre-Islamic practices of several of the area's African societies. In this syncretic version of Islam, ancestor veneration continued, for example, as did the use of magical rituals to drive away spirits believed to cause illness. Women also retained a higher status than they did in other Muslim societies, such as Persia. A large variety of products were traded in the cities of the Swahili coast. Gold, iron, copper, salt, valuable hardwoods such as ebony and sandalwood, ivory, tortoise shells for making decorative objects like combs and animal hides. These goods were brought overland across trade routes from the African interior, and then were either purchased by the cities, inhabitants for their own use or resold elsewhere in Africa, or in Arabia, Persia, and India. From these places, the goods might travel even farther to Southeast Asia or China. Artisans in the cities crafted pottery and wove cloth that became part of the trade too, and were sold in Africa or overseas. The goods of Asia also flowed into these cities, and the elites of the Swahili coast adorned themselves with glass beads from India, dressed in Chinese silks, and ate from Chinese porcelain. Some merchants embedded pieces of porcelain in the walls of their homes for decoration. Slavery on the Swahili coast. Enslaved people were also traded in the markets of East Africa, especially on the island of Zanzibar. East African societies such as the Yao, the Marava, and the Makwa regularly made war upon one another and seized captives for sale. People captured in the interior were marched to the Swahili coast and held there until buyers for them could be found, although starvation, exhaustion, and disease killed nearly 3/4 before they could be sold. The primary buyers were Arab Muslims who wanted laborers, but were not allowed to enslave fellow Muslims. Most of the enslaved Africans were destined for the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere in the Middle East or North Africa, there to work as domestic servants or perform other types of labor. Some were sold as far away from their homes as India or China. Women and children were preferred for household service, but men might find themselves forced into service as soldiers, sailors, or agricultural workers. By the 17th century, the slave trade on the Swahili coast had assumed enormous proportions, with an influx of traders from Oman on the Arabian Peninsula. This growth was due partly to the rise in power of European states, which prevented Muslims from capturing and enslaving people from Eastern Europe, as they had often done in earlier centuries. Between the beginning and the end of the 17th century, the number of enslaved people sold on the Swahili coast quadrupled from roughly 1,000 to 4,000 per year. Some scholars report that twice that number were sold. The activities of European slave traders, who arrived in the region beginning in the 17th century, quickly dwarfed those of the Muslim slavers. The Dutch East India Company purchased approximately 500,000 enslaved people in the 17th and 18th centuries to work in Dutch colonies in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese purchased enslaved people from the island of Mozambique from the 16th to the early 19th centuries, figure 316. The French enslaved more than 100,000 people in their Indian Ocean colonies of Réunion, Mauritius, and the Mascarenes Islands, of which they took control in the 18th century. Even after Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and sent its ships to patrol the Indian Ocean to halt other countries' participation in the trade, the sale of enslaved people continued. People from East Africa were also sold into slavery in the Americas. A drawing shows 10 people walking. 9 of the people walk in a line and are chained together by their necks. They carry baskets on their heads and are dressed in single pieces of cloth. A man with a beard walks next to them. He carries a gun and a sword and is fully clothed and wears a turban on his head. The ground is hard and dry and there are hills in the background. Figure 3:16. The enslaved in Zanzibar. This London News illustration by the British artist William A. Churchill, brother of the British consul in Zanzibar, shows a group of enslaved people in Zanzibar in 1889, a common sight on the Swahili coast where the slave trade flourished from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Credit Modification of Work, A Slave Gang in Zanzibar by W. A. Churchill, by London News/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The contest for the Swahili coast. Kilwa, located on an island off the coast of what is now Tanzania, was the most powerful of the city-states of the Swahili coast. According to legend, it was founded in the 10th century by Ali ibn al-Hasan Shirazi, the son of a Persian noble and an enslaved Ethiopian woman. Ali supposedly settled the island after purchasing it from a local Bantu king. Kilwa's location on an island made it better suited to engaging in the Indian Ocean trade than its rival city to the north, Mogadishu in today's Somalia, and numerous Arab and Persian merchants came to settle in it. In the 1180s, the ruler of Kilwa gained control of the port city of Sofala, on the African mainland in what is now Mozambique. Gold from the mines of the kingdom of Mutapa flowed through Sofala, making it both wealthy and powerful. Control of Sofala enabled the Sultan of Kilwa to escape the dominance of Mogadishu, formerly the most powerful city on the East African coast. The gold also allowed Kilwa to establish or assume control of other cities and island states in East Africa, including Mombasa, Pemba, Mafia, Mozambique, Malindi, Imhambane, Komoro, and Zanzibar. Beyond the book, European views of Sofala. Following are 2 European views of Sofala on the Swahili coast, the port through which the gold of Mutapa flowed. The first image, made by Portuguese historian Manuel Ferreira e Sousa, shows 17th century Sofala in the estuary of the Buzi River, figure 317. A drawing of a map is shown. It is labeled Fortaleza. It shows many waterways cutting the land into smaller areas, some becoming islands. Trees and houses are drawn on the land. An area at the top right of the map surrounded by water is labeled Sofala. Along the bottom of the map, two large ships and two small boats are shown floating in the water. Figure 317 Sofala and its environs. This 17th century Portuguese drawing of Sofala shows it, in the upper right, as located at the mouth of the Buzi River. Credit, Depiction of Sofala, Mozambique, by Asia Portuguesa, Volume 1/Wikimedia Commons, Public Domain. The second image, created a few years after the first for a world atlas by French cartographer Alain Manesson Mallet, shows a close-up of Sofala, figure 3:18. By the time these images were made, very few Portuguese actually lived in Sofala. The city's marshy environment provided an ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes, and many Portuguese contracted malaria. Two colorful drawings are shown. The image on the left shows an area of land surrounded by water with other land around it. There is a sky with clouds above it. Houses, trees, and people are shown on the land. At the top of the image is a yellow sign that says, Sofala. The image on the right is a larger view of the bottom of the first image. It shows the circle of land surrounded by water, showing trees, a fort, houses. On the land outside the water, there is shown farmland, trees, people and mountains, and a sky in the distance. Figure 318 Sofala up close. This French cartographer's copperplate engraving of a view of Sofala, also from the 17th century, shows a close-up look at the city. Credit, Modification of work, View of Sofala, Mozambique, in 1683 by Mallet/Wikimedia Commons, Public Domain. How have the two European artists chosen to depict Sofala? Do these images indicate that it was a wealthy city of prosperous merchants? Do they indicate that it was a dangerous place for Portuguese to live? Explain your answers. Why do you think the artists chose to depict it as they have? In the early 16th century, Portugal attempted to seize the wealth of the Swahili coast, aided by internal dissent within the Sultanate of Kilwa. In 1495, Kilwa's Emir Mohammed, the chief administrator of the city-state, had placed Al-Fudayl ibn Sulayman on the Sultan's throne. Shortly thereafter, Emir Mohammed died, and his successor Emir Ibrahim engineered the assassination of Al-Fudayl ibn Sulayman. Emir Ibrahim then seized power for himself, claiming to rule on behalf of an absent prince. The rulers of several cities within the Kilwa Sultanate were not willing to accept Ibrahim as their overlord, however, and regarded the Portuguese as potential allies in their attempts to claim their independence. The Sheikh of Malindi had already signed a trade agreement with Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, in 1498 in order to compete in trade with both Kilwa and the rival city of Mombasa. Sheikh Issouf, the ruler of Sofala, also signed an agreement with the Portuguese in 1502 in hopes of breaking free of Kilwa's dominance. The Swahili coast city-states had long been trade rivals, and their history of competition with one another prevented them from unifying in the face of the threat of Portuguese domination. Although councillors had encouraged Emir Ibrahim to agree to trade with the Portuguese, he initially rebuffed them. In 1505, Francisco de Almeida, another Portuguese explorer, landed 500 Portuguese soldiers on the island of Kilwa and replaced Emir Ibrahim with a Kilwan aristocrat called Mohammed Arcon, who was more amenable to dealing with the Portuguese. The following year, Mohammed Arcon was assassinated by supporters of Emir Ibrahim and succeeded by a ruler whom they favored. Fearing that the new Sultan Makante would not be easy to control, the Portuguese removed him from power and gave the throne to Arcon's son, Hussein ibn Mohammed. Many Kilwans resented Portuguese interference in the governing of their city-state. They also disliked Portugal's requirement that Kilwans ship goods only on Portuguese-owned ships, a practice that financially harmed many Kilwan merchants. Supporters of Sultan Makante and embittered merchants rose up and did battle in the streets with Portuguese soldiers and followers of Sultan Hussein. Residents fled the city as gangs set fire to buildings. The Portuguese supported Hussein, but also wisely chose to change the policy regarding shipping, and gradually merchants returned to the city. Portugal extended its control along the rest of the Swahili coast as well, establishing trading posts. Because the coastal city-states had never before experienced attacks from the sea, their ports were not fortified and could not easily defend against the Portuguese. The Portuguese were not interested in trading with East African merchants on equal terms, and as they had in India, they looted and sank the ships of rival traders, most of whom were Muslims. Many merchants left the region and moved northward, resulting in a decline in trade. On the southern part of the coast, the Portuguese hoped to exploit the wealth of Mutapa and took control of the kingdom in 1633, but the gold deposits were largely exhausted by this point, and their efforts to convert the population to Roman Catholicism resulted in conflict. Some individual Portuguese did well, marrying African women and receiving land and the right to trade from local African chiefs. For the most part, though, constant conflict with city-states and the effects of tropical diseases such as malaria made it difficult for Portugal to exploit the area. Both the Ottomans and Somalis from the region of Mogadishu feared and resented Portuguese intrusion in East Africa. Joint Somali-Ottoman attacks beginning in the second half of the 1500s wreaked havoc on Portuguese efforts to control the region, figure 3:19. These assaults were followed in the 1650s by attacks by the Omani Sultanate. Portugal had established control over the coast of Oman in 1507. However, in the 1650s, the Omani tribes united to drive the Portuguese out, and soon they began to challenge the Portuguese in East Africa as well. In 1698, Fort Jesus, the Portuguese garrison at Mombasa, fell to Omani forces. Fort Jesus is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Soon thereafter, Portugal lost control of all its remaining colonies on the Swahili coast except Mozambique. The Omani Sultanate had brought the Portuguese attempt to dominate the region to an end. A drawing shows ships sailing in the water. 3 large ships are shown toward the bottom of the drawing with black hulls, white masts, and red flags. A similar ship is shown in the middle of the drawing. 6 small ships with white and red sails are in the top left of the drawing, while there are 4 small ships with black hulls and white sails in the top right of the drawing. Hills appear in the bottom left of the drawing. Figure 3:19 Ottoman fleet at Aden. An Ottoman fleet patrols the Gulf of Aden between Somalia and the Arabian Peninsula in this 16th-century Turkish painting, which shows Aden as the 3 hills in the lower left. The Somali inhabitants of cities on the northern Swahili coast turned to the Ottomans for help against the Portuguese. Credit: Ottoman Fleet Indian Ocean 16th Century by Aramco World/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. With the arrival of the Omanis, the city-state of Zanzibar grew to even greater prominence. The Omanis continued the profitable slave trade, as well as the thriving trade in elephant ivory that had long been part of Zanzibar's economy. Land on the island was redistributed to Omani Arabs, and spice plantations growing primarily cloves were established, earning Zanzibar and the surrounding islands the nickname of Africa's Spice Islands. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the emergence of Kanem-Bornu as a major slave trading society, explain the effect of the arrival of Europeans on the trans-Saharan slave trade, analyze how the slave trade affected the trans-Saharan trade network in West Africa. The sale of enslaved people had been a constant feature of African trade since its earliest days, and over time it became a key component in the continent-spanning network. For some kingdoms, Economic well-being depended on the traffic in human cargo. But this trade also required a near-constant state of warfare and conflict, which had the effect of destabilizing certain regions, particularly around the central Sudan. Then the advent of Europe's age of discovery and exploration in the 15th century transformed the nature of the slave trade in Africa. The wealth of Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, along with their firearms and manufactured goods, appealed to many West African polities, particularly those that emerged along the Gulf of Guinea and the Atlantic coast following the decline of Songhai. These new states, such as Ouitta and Dahomey, enriched themselves by providing the Europeans with captives, the vast majority of whom went to the Americas, in exchange for goods like guns. These developments altered the nature of society in Africa, militarizing states and reorienting African trade. The role of Kanem-Bornu. In about 900 CE, an empire called Kanem arose in the central Sudan, located to the east of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, and confined initially to the northeast of Lake Chad. The accession of Humai I to the throne of Kanem in 1087 marked the beginning of the Muslim Safavid dynasty. Around the same time, a fixed capital was established at Njimi, east of Lake Chad. Over the course of the next century and a half, the Maize kings of Kanem established their control over the region. As in Ghana, the key to establishing and exercising this power was control over the desert caravan routes. Figure 3.20. A map of northwestern Africa is shown. A circular area in Western Africa is labeled Ghana Empire. A pink area is labeled Mali Empire and stretches from the Atlantic to the middle of the map. The region overlaps with most of the region labeled Ghana Empire. A blue area is labeled Songhai Empire. It overlaps with the southeastern half of the Ghana Empire and most of the Mali Empire. The Songhai Empire stretches beyond these empires farther north and east. The cities of Timbuktu and Gao are labeled and located in the overlap between the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire. A green area is highlighted in the central part of northern Africa and labeled Kanem-Bornu Empire. There are red dashed lines going up-down and across from the Kanem-Bornu Empire to northern Africa, as well as to an eastern portion of the Songhai Empire. Figure 320. Trans-Saharan trade. Trans-Saharan trade routes, red dotted lines, were a key factor in the development of the Kanem-Bornu Empire, which resulted from the expansion of the Kanem Empire south into Bornu along the western shore of Lake Chad. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. It was under Danama Dibomi in the 13th century that Kanem reached the height of its power and influence. Commanding a cavalry force of some 40,000, Mai Danama II gained control of the Lake Chad basin and extended the state's control over the trans-Saharan trade northward as far as the Fezzan, southern Libya. Before the end of his reign, he established diplomatic relations with the kings of North Africa, especially in Tunis, thus ensuring the safety of caravans journeying to the distant south from the Mediterranean coast. This achievement guaranteed an increase in cross-Saharan traffic. Although the Kanuri, the people of Kanem, mainly exported ivory and ostrich feathers, they also specialized in the selling of captives to the Muslims of North Africa and later to Europeans, notably the Portuguese who paid in guns and horses. The raids that produced these captives were justified in the name of jihad or holy war against unbelievers, a practice that led to conflict between Kanem and its neighbors. By the mid-13th century, Kanem dominated the central Sudan. The empire extended as far west as the Niger River, as far east as the Wadi Sultanate in eastern Chad, and north to the Sahara Desert. Crowning the Kanuris achievement during this period was the establishment of a tributary state in Bornu, southwest of Lake Chad. Over the course of the next century, however, Kanem became overstretched and weakened by wars and quarrels over succession, notably between the ruling Muslim Safavid dynasty its sons, and the non-Muslim Bulala pastoralists east of Lake Chad. Between 1376 and 1400, the rebellious Bulala, who opposed the imposition of strict Islamic rule under the Sefewa, managed to assassinate 5 of the 6 Sefewa kings. The result of this strife was a destabilized empire, which forced Umar ibn Idris to abandon the capital at Njimi altogether. He led many of the empire's Kanuri to Bornu, in the Savannah region on the western shore of Lake Chad, where they permanently settled. Figure 3. 21. Bornu was better situated to give the kings of the Sefewa dynasty access to a wider trading network, and it already had established vital trading links with the Hausa kingdoms to the west. A map of the northwestern Africa is shown. A circular area in the western portion of Africa is indicated in dashed lines and labeled Ghana Empire. An area encompassing most of the Ghana Empire and extending south and east is indicated by dashed lines and labeled Mali Empire. An area encompassing most of the previous 2 labeled empires and extending east and north is indicated by dashed lines and labeled Songhai Empire. The cities of Timbuktu and Gao are labeled and located in the overlap between the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire. A kidney-shaped area in the eastern portion of the map is highlighted green and labeled Kanem-Bornu Empire. West of the middle of the Kanem-Bornu Empire is a light blue area labeled Bornu Territory. Figure 3. 21. Kanem-Bornu. The kingdom of Kanem-Bornu was less a kingdom than the conjoining of 2 city-states, Kanem and Bornu. The longest-lived of all the African kingdoms, Kanem-Bornu depended primarily on trade in the enslaved, whom it acquired by raiding neighboring states. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. The early decades of the 16th century witnessed a revitalization of the Sefewa dynasty. Under Idris Katakarmab, who ruled from 1507 to 1529, the Sefewa were able to defeat the Bulala. The Sefewa also strengthened their grip on the people of Bornu as they entrenched their rule, prompting a series of internal revolts by the non-Muslim peasant population that they ruthlessly suppressed. The dynasty established firm control over the peasants of Bornu who, once they submitted to Islam, were no longer subjected to raids. The prosperity of Kanem-Bornu was tied to the trans-Saharan trade in enslaved people destined for the markets of North Africa and the Atlantic coast. By the end of the 15th century, Kanem-Bornu was trading about 5,000 captives annually. During the second half of the 16th century, Idris Aloma strengthened his army by importing firearms from North Africa. While the Songhai army failed to modernize, the rulers of Kanem-Bornu established strong relations with the Ottoman Empire in North Africa and gained access to Turkish mercenaries and advisors, who were brought in to train their new army. Figure 3. 22. These changes, combined with the empire's position on the frontier of Islam in central Sudan, enabled it to make deeper slave-raiding incursions against its non-Muslim neighbors. The drawing shows a man on a horse on the right. He is wearing flowing cloths, is barefoot, and holds a spear. On the left there are 3 men wearing masks and cloth wrapped around their waists, holding spears and shields. A crowd of similarly dressed people are in the background holding spears. The bottom of the drawing says, Group of Kanembu warriors. Figure 3. 22. The military might of Kanem-Bornu. Kanem warriors in the 16th century routinely raided nearby communities in central Sudan to capture prisoners they sold to European slave traders. This image comes from The Earth and Its Inhabitants, published in Europe in the 1890s. Credit: Group of Kanembu Warriors by New York Public Library Digital Gallery / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Kanem-Bornu peaked under Aloma, whose administrative and military reforms survived to sustain the empire for more than 100 years. By the end of the 16th century, however, the empire's power had begun to fade. A century later, the state's capacity to maintain its territorial integrity had diminished so severely that the king's rule extended effectively only westward, into Hausaland, present-day northern Nigeria. In the space of 100 years, Fulani from West Africa had made significant inroads against Bornu, and in 1808 they seized the capital of Ngazargamo. The last Sefua king was killed in 1846, but Africa's longest-lived empire managed to continue under new rulers until nearly the end of the 19th century. The arrival of Europeans. Europeans had long known that there were three ancient trade routes through the Saharan desert. In the western Sahara, the route ran from Taghaza to Timbuktu. Farther east, a second route connected the oasis town of Ghadames with trade centers in Hausaland. Finally, there was a route connecting the major Mediterranean port city of Tripoli with Bornu in the Central African interior. Centuries of caravan trade along these routes had not, however, made them any less hazardous. Thus, those who knew the routes and the location of key cities and oases, and who appreciated the inherent risks of Saharan weather patterns, were in the best position to control and profit from trans-Saharan trade. It was therefore in the best interest of the Muslim and Arab travelers and caravanners who possessed this knowledge to monopolize it. To share it would undercut their profits. Consequently, European maps of the African interior remained sketchy. Distances were mere estimates, and the locations of important cities such as Timbuktu and Kano were a matter of guesswork. Add to this the threat of raids and the possibility of a hostile merchant population, and to Europeans the undertaking of a trans-Saharan journey by themselves seemed likely to be disastrous. In the 15th and 16th centuries, however, pressures mounted on European powers to boost their sources of national wealth, an urgency inflamed by the discovery of the Americas and the expense of traveling and setting up competing colonies there. Increasingly, European states desired to circumvent the intermediaries who controlled the trade in exotic luxury goods and vital raw materials, such as Chinese silk, Indonesian spices, and African gold. It was no easy matter to wrest control from these merchants, whose monopolies were often supported by kingdoms and states that benefited from it. The challenge was quite severe for poorer European states, such as Portugal. When the Portuguese began their voyages along the West African coast, their immediate goal was not to discover a new trading route to India. Rather, it was to secure West African gold. Europeans had been aware of the region's gold fields since the 14th century, when Sudanic gold had been imported as a raw material to mint European coins. By the mid-15th century, the Portuguese had made inroads along the Senegambian coast, raiding Amazigh settlements on the island of Arguin, an extension of the trans-Saharan trade routes, taking captives to be enslaved on Iberian plantations, and exploring along the Senegal and Gambia rivers in search of sources of gold. These ventures mark some of the earliest attempts at direct European involvement in trans-Saharan trade. The Portuguese monarchy also hired explorers such as Alvise Cadamosto, a Venetian slaver sent to scout the region of Senegambia. These efforts gave the Portuguese an opportunity to develop a clearer sense of the scope of trans-Saharan trade, including interactions with the Wolof, who sold enslaved people along the interior trade routes in West Africa. A few decades after Cadamosto had met the vassal kings of Mali in the Gambia region, the Portuguese established Elmina, the mine, a fort on the African coast south of the Akan gold fields. Located in present-day Ghana, Elmina was a fortified trading post from which the Portuguese traded copper, brass, and cloth with Africans for Akan gold. The mines at Akan also relied on enslaved workers, whom the Portuguese bought from Benin and then sold to Mande-speaking Dula traders. By the turn of the 16th century, the Portuguese had also entered West Africa's cowrie shell currency market, providing shells along with luxury goods to the regional market in exchange for still more gold. Progressively, They diverted traffic away from the centuries-old trans-Saharan trade routes and along the West African coast. The Portuguese first laid eyes on São Tomé and Príncipe, a pair of islands in the Gulf of Guinea, in the 1470s. By 1500, they had successfully settled both, which were prized for their strategic location off the West African coast and for their tropical climate and volcanic soil, ideal for planting and harvesting sugar. It was not long before large-scale sugar plantations sprang up on the islands, and the Portuguese entrenched themselves in the Gulf of Guinea. The production of sugar is a notoriously labor-intensive process and requires a huge workforce. African chiefdoms and coastal intermediaries had demonstrated to the Portuguese their willingness to sell captives, whom the Europeans could enslave as laborers where needed. Indeed, as the plantation economy on São Tomé expanded, its need for slave labor grew. By the early 16th century, the island was Europe's single largest sugar supplier and home to a vast enslaved workforce, which the settlers obtained from Elmina. Less than 40 years elapsed between the Portuguese settlement of São Tomé and Príncipe and the first transatlantic voyages of African captives who were sold into slavery in the Americas. Recognizing an opportunity to profit, chiefs on the African mainland engaged in raids against their neighbors to generate captives they could sell to the Europeans, first to the Portuguese and later to the Dutch, Spanish, French, and English. As competition rose among the European powers to establish trading posts along the West African coast, tensions flared among African polities as they either engaged in or resisted the growing trade in enslaved people. Then, when Songhai, the largest and most powerful of the Sudanic kingdoms in the 16th century, was shattered by the Moroccan army at the Battle of Tondibai, 1591, the situation in West Africa was permanently altered. Without a powerful central authority, a host of small states emerged whose chiefs saw the benefits of dealing directly with wealthy Europeans, rather than through the centuries-old system of caravan trade. These developments resulted in a dramatic change in the size and scope of the trade in enslaved Africans, from a few thousand people in the 16th century to tens of thousands in the 17th, and for much of the next century, an average of about 45,000 people per year. Link to learning. Learn more about the transatlantic slave trade as presented by National Museums Liverpool. Also learn about the role played by Europeans in the trade and life in West Africa before the trade. The later trans-Saharan slave trade. Africa was transformed during the 18th century. This period witnessed the emergence of expansionist new states in West Africa, such as Dahomey and Segu, whose wars of conquest generated captives for European slavers. It also saw a sharp rise in conflict between African states and related growth in the trade in enslaved captives. Such growth came at the expense of the historical trans-Saharan trade network, which was disrupted and reoriented to prioritize the traffic in captive human cargo destined for coastal slave markets. While the overall numbers varied by location, the general trend was an increase in the number of captives being moved along the trans-Saharan corridors during the 18th century. This trade did more than benefit merchants. In many instances, it provided a boon to businesses and firms related to the slave trade that were located at trans-Saharan trading centers. The societies as a whole did not benefit, however, nor did the people who were enslaved. As a result of this altered state of affairs, the scope of the trans-Saharan trade in enslaved people doubled between the 17th and 18th centuries to an estimated 900,000 enslaved people. The development of the trading state of Ouidah provides a unique window into these dynamics. Situated in the Bight of Benin on the Gulf of Guinea, along what came to be called the Slave Coast, Ouidah was transformed with the arrival of the Europeans in West Africa in the 15th century. Figure 3.23. By the 17th century, the French West India Company had moved its main trading site to Ouidah, making it one of the region's most important slave ports, second only to Luanda in Angola. By the end of the century, the Dutch West India Company, the English Royal African Company, and the Portuguese all had moved their slave markets to Whydah. Several of these European powers went on to establish coastal trading forts there. Between 1650 and 1690, the number of captives brought to Whydah in caravans increased dramatically, from about 1,000 people per year to about 10,000. It is estimated that in the quarter century between 1700 and 1725, fully a third of all captives coming from Africa, approximately 378,000 of them, were taken out of Whydah. This image shows several groups of people surrounded by a fence. In the back center, there is a large covered platform. A man sits in front of it. Another man stands on his right and holds a parasol over him. A group of people sit on the ground on his left and gaze up at him. In the far right corner, a group of people sit on the ground and hold spears. In the bottom right corner, there is another group of people. Some of them lie prostrate. Others play instruments and drums. Beside them, through an opening in the fence, people march in carrying rifles. In the bottom left corner, a group of people sit on the ground and face the man sitting on a chair in the background. Along the left side of the fence, many people dressed in European clothes sit in chairs. Others stand and hold flags. In the center of the fenced area is a snake, two children on their knees and a man kneeling, holding a piece of paper. Outside the fence are several trees and houses. Some people sit on chairs and others are on the ground. Several people stand near cannons and carry weapons. Figure 3. 23 crowning a king on the slave coast. The kings of Whydah had a very close relationship with the European slavers who established trading centers along the Gulf of Guinea. In this French etching from about 1725, a new king is crowned before an audience that includes Europeans. Credit, Coronation Ceremony for the King of Whydah by Gallica/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Whydah's flourishing trade in enslaved people did not result from wars waged by its own rulers, but from its location at the end point of trade routes between battling factions. One route originated from the former Mali Empire. Some captives from there wore Muslim clothing and had been in transit for 3 months before arriving in Whydah. Another route originated in the Yoruba kingdom of Oyo, which was engaged in a series of wars against the neighboring kingdoms of Nupe and Borgu. The value of enslaved captives passing through Whydah was enormous, and the slave trade benefited both the African slave merchants and the state, which was entitled to customs duties and taxes. From providing porterage services to supplying food and other necessities that made the trade possible, local businesses also profited from the sale of enslaved people. As elsewhere, the transport and sale of captives into slavery produced a profitable economy for virtually everyone involved, except for the enslaved people. In 1727, King Agaja of Dahomey conquered the kingdom of Whydah and incorporated it into his own. Figure 3. 24. The fall of Whydah was part of a larger campaign by Agaja to restore traditional social and political controls over the region, which was then home to several smaller Aja kingdoms including Dahomey. By 1737, Agaja had conquered the entire slave coast and brought it under Dahomey's control. However, initially Dahomey was reluctant to continue the practice of selling Africans to Europeans. This was not to the liking of the kingdom of Oyo, whose foreign trade depended on it. By the middle of the century, near-constant warfare against Oyo, which disrupted interior trade routes and hurt both kingdoms economically, convinced the rulers of Dahomey to abandon their reluctance. They opted instead to exercise strict royal control over the slave coast trade. Dahomey went on to become one of the major exporters of enslaved captives, which the state traded in exchange for firearms. By the end of the century, Dahomey had become one of the most heavily armed and militarized states in West Africa. There are 2 maps. The map on the right shows Asia, Europe, and Africa. A small portion of the west coast of Africa is highlighted. The map on the left shows the highlighted area of the first map in greater detail. The map on the left shows the location of Côte d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Niger, and Nigeria. Part of southern Benin is labeled the Kingdom of Dahomey and includes the city Ouitta. Figure 324, the Slave Coast. New states like Ouitta and Dahomey emerged along the Gulf of Guinea coast in the 18th century. These states were formed primarily as a result of the European slave trade, which is why this coastal region was known as the Slave Coast. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. As Agaja and his successors extended their control over the Gulf of Guinea, the frontier of the slave trade on the West African coast was pushed deeper into the African interior, beyond the kingdoms that ranged along the Senegambia. It is estimated that well over half the captives taken and sold during the 18th century came from the far interior, many from the Kingdom of Segu, located southwest of Djenné on the Middle Niger in Mali. In their own words, Aloda Equiano describes the slave trade. Aloda Equiano was born in the 18th century in what is now Nigeria. When he was a child, he and his sister were kidnapped and sold to European slave traders. After many years of enslavement in the Caribbean and the southern British mainland colonies, he obtained his freedom, settled in London where he advocated for abolition, and wrote an account of his life. In the excerpts that follow, he describes what he knew of slavery as a child in Africa. As you read, note how people came to be enslaved and the place of enslaved people in Equiano's society. The markets are sometimes visited by stout mahogany-colored men from the southwest of us. We call them Oyibo, which term signifies red men living at a distance. They generally bring us firearms, gunpowder, hats, beads, and dried fish. These articles they barter with us for odoriferous woods and earth, and our salt of wood ashes. They always carry slaves through our land, but the strictest account is exacted of their manner of procuring them before they are suffered to pass. Sometimes, indeed, we sold slaves to them, but they were only prisoners of war, or such among us as had been convicted of kidnapping or adultery, and some other crimes which we esteemed heinous. When our people go out to till their land, they not only go in a body, but generally take their arms with them for fear of a surprise. And when they apprehend an invasion, they guard the avenues to their dwellings by driving sticks into the ground, which are so sharp at one end as to pierce the foot, and are generally dipped in poison. From what I can recollect of these battles, they appear to have been eruptions of one little state or district on the other, to obtain prisoners or booty. Perhaps they were incited to this by those traders who brought the European goods I mentioned among us. Those prisoners which were not sold or redeemed we kept as slaves, but how different was their condition from that of the slaves in the West Indies. With us they do no more work than other members of the community, even their master. Their food, clothing, and lodging were nearly the same as theirs, except that they were not permitted to eat with those who were free-born. Some of these slaves have even slaves under them as their own property and for their own use. Generally, when the grown people in the neighborhood were gone far in the fields to labor, the children assembled together in some of the neighbors' premises to play, and commonly some of us used to get up a tree to look out for any assailant or kidnapper that might come upon us, for they sometimes took these opportunities of our parents' absence to attack and carry off as many as they could seize. Aloda Equiano, the interesting narrative of the life of Aloda Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African, written by himself. According to Equiano, how did Africans come to be enslaved? How common was it for Africans to enslave other Africans? How did Africans treat the people they enslaved? What role did Europeans play in the trade? Founded by Mamari Kulubali in 1712, Segu made warfare a way of life. The Segu kingdom's economy was trade-based, and its essential trade good was enslaved people, the state acquired through raiding and warfare waged against its neighbors. These incursions reached as far as north as the Niger Bend and Timbuktu, which the Segu briefly occupied. Once captured, those seized by the Segu military faced two possible fates. They could be sold to desert nomads as part of the trans-Saharan slave trade, or they could be sold to caravan merchants who dealt with European slave traders on the slave coast. Although perhaps most pronounced in West Africa, the altered dynamics of trans-Saharan trade in enslaved people in the 18th century were also apparent in North Africa. Scholars have estimated that the Maghreb, encompassing Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, received an average of 6,000 enslaved Africans every year between 1700 and 1799. About 1,400 enslaved people a year passed through Ghadames and the Oasis Center of the Fezzan in Libya, both historically vital to the trans-Saharan trade between central Sudan and Tripoli. But by mid-century, these centers, also the destination points for some caravans from West African trade centers such as Timbuktu, were sending larger caravans of captives to the markets at Tripoli. By the end of the 18th century, the numbers of the enslaved bound for market along the Mediterranean coast had increased by as much as a quarter, making the trade in enslaved Africans through Tripoli a key component of the region's economy.